Howdy folks, and welcome back to the farm. Today we're going to finish talking about my experience with cult leadership. We'll talk about where did this drive to become a cult leader come from? And who were my role models growing up? And how did it all play out? Did it end with a giant shootout with the FBI? Did tanks crash their way into our compound? Is there any creepy VHS tape video of me playing an acoustic guitar in a basement with a bunch of kids? Singing church hymns? Did it end with a lot of people being forced to drink poisoned Kool-Aid? And by the way, it was not actually Kool-Aid. The dramatic and horrible ending of the Jim Jones cult spawned the expression to drink the Kool-Aid, meaning to completely accept as fact without question some terrible ideas that people might be fed in a cult-type environment. And, of course, in the Jim Jones instance, to drink the Kool-Aid meant to willingly die for the cult, for what you were supposed to be believing. But it wasn't Kool-Aid, it was actually a product called Flavor Aid, which I believe may not have been entirely just a choice based on cost, because this event did not occur in the United States. It occurred in Guyana, I believe, and Flavor Aid was just a British product that was more available in that area. However, a good cult leader is going to want their people to go out in style, and they're going to do better than just some grape Flavor Aid. I mean, come on. Now, if you want to do it right, one cult that did it the right way and used beverages in style would be the followers of the Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh in Oregon in the 1980s. There's a great documentary about them called Wild Wild Country, and it chronicles their attempts to basically take over a county in the Pacific Northwest and their battles with the local government and their struggle to build a gigantic compound/settlement for their cult. And one thing they needed to do was they needed to bump up their voting numbers ahead of an election so that they could win some advantage in the local government. They needed about 7,000 votes, I believe. The sort of de facto leader or prime minister of the cult was a woman named Ma Anand Sheela. And Ma Anand Sheela was a very strong leader, and she made decisions that she was willing to step up and make the tough decisions. And so they needed 7,000 votes. And how are they going to grow their compound by 7,000 people so quickly? Well, her idea was to hire these buses, these charter buses, that would go to different major cities like San Francisco, and they would basically recruit new cult members, mostly from the homeless communities in those cities. And they collected their 7,000 people by promising them that they would have a home in their compound back in Oregon, and that they would be able to experience spiritual enlightenment with everyone else and seek their personal fulfillment and freedom in this new, beautiful country. Well, when they got there, they did have housing for them, and they had free food. In particular, everybody was pretty excited to find out that there was free booze twice a day. That twice a day you could go get a free draft beer from a designated location in the compound. Now, A lot of the followers of Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh were professionals. They were people of relatively high socioeconomic status. So there were plenty of doctors and lawyers and, in particular, psychiatrists that were in the cult. And one thing that Ma Anand Sheila had learned from one of her ex-psychiatrist friends was that there was this drug called Thorazine. And you could put it in something like beer, for example, and it would make people very calm and very pliable, very suggestible. So her idea was that if you dose the beer with Thorazine and you get those 7,000 people to drink the Thorazine beer twice a day, they would be very easy to manage, and it would be very easy to convince them to get on the bus to go vote come election day in the local elections. And it worked out fairly well. Believe it or not, Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh was eventually forced to leave the United States and returned to India and continued to have a pretty big following under the name Osho. He changed his name. Now, his Grand Vizier, Ma Anand Sheila, she ended up fleeing the country also, but she went to Germany. And I believe she is still alive. But enough about them. Now, as far as my cult was concerned, one thing I'm very proud to say is that all of the drinking was entirely consensual. No one was forced to drink anything, and everything that everybody drank was completely disclosed to them beforehand. And in particular, there was a lot of drinking at these events put on by the Dionysium group. And my last big hurrah, as I mentioned earlier, with the Dionysium group, was a debate that I participated in about the nature of Bruce Lee's death. And I'll explain later about how this was set up, but I want to take us to that particular night at the Alamo Drafthouse. On stage, I had spent a couple of hours preparing my statements. I didn't know who my debate partner was going to be. And I noticed that the person who joined me on stage was not nearly as professionally dressed. No, it wasn't the comedian who came to a meeting of Austin Naturalism and then later said that I wasn't as funny as I thought I was. Luckily, it wasn't that guy because A, he wasn't particularly funny himself, and B, that would have really hurt my confidence going into this debate. But he was a young Caucasian man of about the same age and build. Both of them had red hair, if I recall, and they were both conspicuously underdressed, as in a ratty t-shirt and jeans and sneakers, as compared to my suit and tie. And strangely enough, you guys might be completely surprised to find out that I was set to argue that Bruce Lee's death was an accident, and it was brought about by his lifestyle choices and the performance-enhancing drugs that he was taking, mixed in with some recreational drugs he may have been taking. And a lot of the cover-up had to do with the fact that he was found at one of his Hong Kong girlfriend's apartments, and the local news media didn't want to upset too many people back in the United States, and so there was some strangeness about who was told what when. But my opponent was set to actually argue the conspiracy theory side of it. It's surprising. You might think that I would be on that side, but no. I knew that I was going to have to deal with some story about how Bruce Lee had been possibly poisoned by the Chinese triads or some underworld group that represented the interests of the old traditional kung fu masters who were angry at Bruce Lee for teaching Westerners the old martial arts. But there I was, on stage, in one of my best suits, note cards in hand, making sure I was talking directly into the mic, staring out over the audience to give the impression of eye contact without actually looking anyone in the eye. So I start my opening statement, and I'm very serious and forceful as usual, and I throw a lot of facts and statements that I took from police reports and comments by medical professionals looking at the evidence of what was seen in Bruce Lee's blood. And then as I wrap it up, there's a scattering of polite but strained applause. Then my conspicuously underdressed opponent begins.
Well, that is bullshit, and you know it. Tonight, I'm gonna prove that Bruce Lee was murdered by agents of the Illuminati. And you, sir, dare to stand there and carry water for these evil and corrupt monsters who robbed us of priceless years of ass-kicking cinema.
And so, you might be wondering how I got here. I did a lot of thinking about my past to prepare the script for these episodes. And with my 2020 hindsight, I started to see patterns and spot feelings that I didn't know that I had, or that I can see more clearly now than I did back then. I think part of what I was trying to do, and what I continue to try to do now, is to fill a leadership gap. And I think we've had a leadership gap since the 1970s or 1980s, because I think our last good crop of leaders was born into the World War II generation, and some in the silent generation. And so what we're talking about basically are people born before 1945, and especially people born before 1930, the people that were old enough to participate in World War II. And if there's one thing I can say about my experience with my mother's father, who I spent a lot of time with growing up, he showed me that leadership is about the little things, that little things reflect big things, that there really isn't a such thing as something that's not a big deal. And I'll give you an example. I recall being impatient or frustrated one time when we were in a drive-thru. I was in a drive-thru with my grandfather. Most likely, it was a Dairy Queen or maybe a Shipley's Donuts. We had gotten our food, but when we left the drive-thru, my grandfather became annoyed and got back in line so that he would be able to talk to the person at the window again. Not because his food was wrong. We got everything we ordered, and it was just right. But he had gotten too much change. He was owed like $1.35, but they gave him $5.35, or they gave him too many quarters. I forgot the exact amount, but it was less than $5. It was a small amount, but they had given my grandfather too much money back. And so he needed to get back in line so that he could give the cashier the money that he was given inappropriately. This is interesting because for my grandfather, there were a variety of reasons why he felt like he needed to get back in line. Number one, it was a matter of pride. My grandfather wouldn't want anyone to think that he was stealing. He certainly didn't need their money. He would have been ashamed to keep the money because it wasn't his, even if it was just 35 cents. And then in particular, he wanted to show the cashier that they had given him too much change and maybe improve their performance in the future and protect the business. And yeah, that reflects a big picture view of the world, but that was my grandfather's view of the world. He was like Truman. With Papa, he thought through every issue all the way up to the top. The buck stopped with him. And by watching him think this way and deal with situations like getting too much change in the way that he did, he conveyed to me something about the world without ever using the following words. The following words are a common sentence that people say to evoke a particular feeling, but it's a feeling that my grandfather conveyed to me very clearly growing up. Although, I have to stress, he never actually said the words, but the idea is, no one is coming to save you. People save themselves. Strong people survive. And in my family, the worst thing that you could be accused of being was lazy or to be a liar. And that sense of responsibility over oneself, one's family, the country, the future, that sense of responsibility for all that was present in all of my grandfather's interactions. And in particular, even when he complained about politicians on the news, there was a feeling that it was his responsibility to find out what these people were doing and to bring them to task, to hold them accountable. And he brought me into these discussions with the idea that as an adult, it would soon be my responsibility to try to make society better. So what he was trying to do was convey the importance of being informed. He was showing me, hey, grandson, check out these people. These are the people who are going to try to fleece you when you grow up. These are the people who are going to try to lie to you your whole life. And my grandfather made sure I knew that. My grandfather loved the United States. He was on Normandy Beach on D-Day, but he had zero love for the people of the government of the United States. He was never a fan of any person in Congress that I ever knew. He definitely was about his family and what the country stood for. And I think, like most people, he didn't even love most Americans. As you might suspect, being born in rural Louisiana in 1923 would tend to make someone very traditional in their beliefs about marriage and family. My grandfather was raised Catholic. And so, in the early 80s, as I was approaching adolescence, but not quite there, living with my grandfather, I think he had some concerns because here I am, a kid who loves science fiction and Devo and MTV and loves to draw and is really into the choir and likes to skip and whistle and has almost no interest in sports of any kind. Long story short, I do think my grandfather suspected I might be gay early on, but I think that was alleviated when I became so enthusiastic about martial arts, and when I eventually got some girlfriends, then his concerns were relieved. But I think my grandfather's example of leadership was a very strong influence on how I approached not only life, but this urge toward starting cults. Because once I saw that humans need leadership, then, of course, it became easy for me to think of examples of what kind of leaders they might need. One of my big leadership examples growing up was one that my grandfather directed me toward. It was his model of leadership when he was young, a man named George Patton III, and he was a general in the U.S. Army, a graduate of West Point, where he graduated with a perfect score, 0 demerits. He was a combat veteran of World War I, and he was an officer and a general throughout World War II. My grandfather served under George Patton in 1944 and 1945, and when I was a kid, he very enthusiastically showed me this movie called Patton that came out in 1972, shortly before I was born. When I saw it, I was blown away by the drive and the clarity and the charisma of the character. And I thought to myself, well, we need more of this guy. And I remember in school, we had to give a presentation. And I believe this was 6th grade. And my presentation was, of course, on George Patton. And I dressed up like George Patton. I had the cavalry boots and the flared pants and the riding crop and the leather strap across the chest and the helmet with the 4 stars. And I got up there and I gave a gruff speech and insulted some of the kids in the front row. And people thought it was kind of funny, but that was me practicing to be a cult leader. That was me expressing a desire to be a leader someday in the future. That was my tryout in 6th grade. I was little George Patton. And of course, I loved the ugly Machiavellian type things that George Patton would say. And I think that is part of being a leader, is to say ugly things. I think we have this idea that leaders say the nice things that make people feel good. And that's more marketing. That's more manipulation. If what a person says never challenges you, never shocks you, never makes you feel bad, then they're not telling you the truth. Anyone who's telling you the truth is going to shock you, is going to say things that sound gruff, weird, ugly, and maybe even calculated to insult you. But sometimes they are things that need to be said. Like, for example, how George Patton starts off the speech that begins the movie Patton in 1972, starring George C. Scott, where he steps up on stage and he says simply, "No bastard ever won a war by dying for his country. He won it by making the other poor, dumb bastard die for his country." It was quotes like that that led me to George Patton, because I felt like here's someone who tells it like it really is. Here's someone who won't lie about the ugliness of life. And I think that's one thing I saw, is that people from the older generations tended not to hide the ugliness of life. Where I saw that people born after World War II, maybe because of just the unrealistic vibe of the time, it was Western civilization's victory lap over whatever the Axis powers represented, and historians will be working that out for a while. But it was an era of unrealism, and I think some of the creeping doubts about whether our lives were sustainable started to seep in the 1980s. And when I was a kid watching movies like Wall Street or Platoon, I start to think, well, we could use a little kick in the pants. We could use some good leadership, some clarity of thought, someone who will step in and say, yes, this is unsustainable. No, you can't do that. Know that knuckling under to whoever's in charge and working hard at jobs you don't like and dying under terms that aren't under your control is something that we can't avoid. It's the nature of life. And I think, looking back, maybe it wasn't a coincidence that my grandfather died in 2005. My first child was born in 2003. My second child was born in 2008. And sure enough, by 2011, here I am putting out ads on Craigslist. And it makes me wonder, in the back of my mind, was I seeing that, wow, I guess now it is my turn. The World War II generation is gone. There needs to be a voice for real life. There needs to be a voice for ugliness that looks at people and says, hey, happiness is not the goal you should be seeking. Happiness is vastly overrated. Show me someone who lives for their own happiness, and I'll show you someone who is anxious and miserable and a failure. Because successful people focus on duty, not happiness. They focus on, what am I supposed to be doing? What's good for society? What's good for family? What will make me a smarter, stronger, better person 2 years from now? What could I get up and do today or learn today that will make Western civilization stronger? That's the kind of thinking I think that we need more of. That life isn't about having your favorite flavor of ice cream ready to go in the freezer. That life is really about the future. It's about where we've been and what comes next. And notice, neither of those have anything to do with you. Where we've been has nothing to do with you, because it's what happened to people before you were ever born. And then where we're going has nothing to do with you. It's about, what are you leaving behind? What are people going to remember you for? What's your legacy? Is civilization better because you came around? Or did you kick a big dent in everyone else's prosperity and happiness on your way out? I think that's the kind of calculation that we really will have to make. And so, this business of looking back at my past and thinking about my relationship with my grandfather and what he represented in my life, that covers the more social, psychological, learned experience element of why I did what I did. But one thing I try to do is to get people to look at the things that they tend to ignore. And in our society, we ignore genetics all the time, and we ignore them to our peril. And so I think that a lot of what I did in 2011 as far as trying to start this group has to do with just who I am as a person and how I was born. And that leads us to personality types. And I'm going to talk about the Myers-Briggs types, also known as the MBTI. But I'm fully aware that the Myers-Briggs business is a private business and not science. And a lot of it is anecdotal based on work studies. However, the elements of the Myers-Briggs types, the 4 letters that you're evaluated on, do intersect with the quote-unquote Big Five, the Big Five personality elements that are hard science. And these are personality traits that everybody has. Everybody is on the scale in these areas, and they are fixed early in life and appear to be heavily genetic. Now, before we go on to Myers-Briggs, let's go ahead and tip our hat to the hard science, and if you want to investigate this, go for it. But the Big Five personality traits, the 5 scales that we all fit somewhere within, are, first of all, of course, extroversion and introversion. Everybody's somewhere between those 2 extremes. Of course, I would be an example of an unusually extroverted person. Then there's openness to new experience. And boy, am I open to new experiences. I'm clearly very high on that scale because, well, that's where a lot of my content comes from. Stuff I've tried in the past. Then there's conscientiousness. And I'm not maxed out on this, but I'm a lot higher than usual. Then there's neuroticism, and I'm extremely low in neuroticism, and on measures of sort of self-confidence, I'm very high on that. And I don't see that as some kind of great strength. I mean, Really, that just means you're obsessed with yourself and you think you're invincible. And that can be a huge problem. But anyway, the last one is agreeableness. And this is pretty much, how much are you willing to go along to get along? How much do the emotions of the people around you determine your emotions? And how much are you willing to knock the table over socially? Well, it turns out I'm fairly low on agreeableness, and stirring the pot is a phrase that people who know me tend to use to describe what I tend to do in social situations sometimes, especially when I was younger. I don't do it so much anymore. And so back to the Myers-Briggs types. What does this have to do with being a cult leader? Well, it turns out that my Myers-Briggs type is ENTJ, which is described as the commander or the field marshal personality type. And let's just say cult leaders are specifically mentioned in the description of ENTJ. And if you want to know what an ENTJ is like, well, all you have to do is watch a movie, because the bad guy in any action movie is going to be an ENTJ usually. So some famous real-life ENTJs include Napoleon Bonaparte or Steve Jobs. And then some famous movie character ENTJs would be Darth Vader or Bane from The Dark Knight Rises. And here's my thought. This is not because ENTJs are actually evil or are statistically more likely to become James Bond villains. I think it's just because ENTJs are easy to write. They're fun to write because they love to speechify. Typical real-life villains are boring because they don't like to talk much. They like to hide in the background. I mean, they're doing something wrong, after all. A thief generally doesn't want to make big speeches about what they stole and how they stole it. They want to blend into the background and enjoy their loot. But not an ENTJ. ENTJs want everybody to know who they are, and they dress strangely so that people will remember them. And they use snarky catchphrases that people remember, and they love to give speeches about their motivations and why they do what they do. So, if you're writing a screenplay, make your villain an ENTJ because they make it easy for the audience. They love to tell the audience exactly what they're doing and why. And then you have the added advantage that ENTJs are known to be obsessive about learning new skills or finding out information that might help them reach their goals. So they tend to be the kind of people who are always studying something on the side or practicing something on the side in case they need to use it in the future. And so that really helps when you're writing a character, because then you're like, how do they know how to use that acetylene torch to cut through the hinges of that bank safe? Well, you come up with some interesting side job that they had, or they just knew that they would need to know how to do that someday, and so they just learned it. Well, if your character is an ENTJ, that's actually realistic. So that's what I think. We get a bad rap because we're fun to write. In The Dark Knight Rises, they kind of got it right, because it turns out that Bane was doing what he was doing because of some emotions that he actually had that no one knew that he had. That's something about ENTJs that you come across, is people tend to just think they don't have emotions. And it's like, well, no, it's, if you're going to be a leader, if you're concerned about being good at winning conflicts and getting your way, then the last thing you want is for people to know what you're feeling, or to know what you really love, or what you're really afraid of. This is information that can easily be used against you, so you play your cards close to the chest. And so if all your enemies think that you are an emotionally indestructible, relentless robot that will never stop until they're all steamrolled and defeated, I mean, that's good. It has the disadvantage of motivating your enemy. If your enemy is also an ENTJ, then you might be in trouble, because they're going to be making themselves into a cold-blooded monster just as quickly as you are. Now, in my last volume about the cult, I talked about the reasons why the cult ended and what led me to stop putting up ads and what led me to stop organizing the meetings and use that time for other activities. Well, what's strange is that it came to a head in really one conversation that I had with the young lady who had cystic fibrosis, and she was struggling with that condition, and her boyfriend, who was one of the early enthusiastic members of the group, who loved to argue, especially with me, but I respected his intellectual abilities, and I thought he was a strong thinker. The problem that we started to have was that his girlfriend began to struggle more and more with symptoms of depression because of the challenges that she had because of her medical condition. And she was having trouble integrating some of his activities and ideas into her life, which she felt was going to be short. And she had gone to see a psychiatrist, and she was seeking some pharmaceutical treatments for her depression. Now, he made it clear that he was of the opinion that she should deal with her emotional issues on her own, that she should use basically philosophical skills and emotional self-discipline and deep contemplation to assist with her depression. Now, these things are all helpful, but especially at the time, I made it clear that I thought it was okay for her to look into these drugs for treatment, and we just really keep an eye on her personality. Ultimately, it had to do with, did she feel like herself taking these drugs? Did they feel like they turned her into a zombie, or she felt sort of dead inside, or uncreative, or hyper-emotional, if we go to the other end of the spectrum? But he felt like by seeking this medical attention and by seeking psychiatric drugs, that she was essentially giving up. And I thought he was wrong about that. I thought that he was being a little too categorical and ruling out options for her that might make her quality of life much better. We really had no way of knowing for sure. And this was the early 2010s. There had been some good recent developments in pharmaceutical treatments for various mental conditions. And so my relationship with the philosopher boyfriend was never quite the same after that. I think he felt that I was betraying some of the principles of the group because we were so committed to thinking things through and using older, more contemplative methods to deal with issues. But the whole point was that we were going to integrate modern developments. That even though we recognized that there was this deep psychological element of the human condition that used to be discussed in terms of a soul or what we would call spiritual health, that we recognized that the modern world had ignored that to its peril, and that we were trying to reclaim some sort of ownership or discussion of this part of the human mind. At the same time, we were still fully aware, and we wanted to embrace the idea that the human mind is produced by a biological device. We are our brains, after all, even though it appears that our full experience of consciousness involves more than just the brain. We still have to take the brain into account. It's still a big part of the puzzle. And the brain is a chemical device. So pharmaceutical interventions are reasonable. But here's my big disagreement. Here's my big caution about the use of these drugs. Looking at the world from my position in life here in 2025, I think one thing we can say is that the drugs work, but be careful that you're not using the drugs to medicate yourself so that you're able to emotionally survive living an inhuman or inappropriate life. In other words, I'm sure there are all sorts of psychiatric drugs that I would recommend to someone who is in solitary confinement, or someone who is chained to a rock at the top of a mountain and I know that they're going to have to live up there for weeks until they just die. I think there are drugs that I would recommend that would make them feel better about their situation while they're in solitary confinement or chained to a pit in a dungeon somewhere in medieval France or modern North Korea. But at that point, you have to say, well, gosh, Vincent, they wouldn't need these drugs if they weren't in solitary confinement. They wouldn't need these drugs if they weren't being tortured in a dungeon or chained to the top of a mountain. And that's what I'm getting at. Modern life, in other words, the life that we expect our young people to live, the kind of living conditions that they live in, i.e., usually utterly alone, glued to devices, having few face-to-face social interactions with people who actually care about them. And when it comes to dating and mating behavior, you're either on some sort of hyper-promiscuity carousel, or you live like a monk and you haven't touched another human in years. Everyone seems to be on one of those two extremes. And we do jobs that we hate, that are owned by corporations that are spending millions of dollars to bring about that glorious day when they can just lay you off and replace you with some sort of automation. This is the life we expect people to live. And then when they get mentally ill from it, we put them on medication. And so my point is, yes, there is a place for these drugs. These medications can work. I am in no way saying that you should stop using them or giving people some sort of guilt trip about them. What I am saying is a lot of times these drugs are very helpful in allowing you to live a terrible life. They're very helpful in allowing you to survive psychologically, doing something for 10 years that maybe you shouldn't have. Working a job that every fiber of your being was screaming that you should leave. You might be taking medication to help you stay in a better mood when you have to deal with a particular person. But maybe you should get that person out of your life, and then you wouldn't need the drugs. Maybe it's not the drugs. Maybe it's your life. Maybe it's your job. Maybe it's your attitude. I think in a lot of cases, the drugs are designed to mask a lack of hope. The drugs kind of artificially turn on a little light at the end of the tunnel in your brain, metaphorically, in your mind, instead of the glow in your mind's eye of the glorious day when your job comes to whatever fruition you're hoping for, or that your relationship becomes what you want it to be, or that your life in general gets to the stage that you were hoping for. When that happens, the drugs won't be necessary, right? I think it's important to think about the kind of life that we are designed to live, the kind of life that humans are supposed to live neurologically and biologically. As far as we can tell, humans are designed to live in fairly small groups, somewhere around 140 people, max, in a settlement. Anytime people live in a settlement where there's more than 140 people, anytime people start to live in a settlement where they don't know most people, or most people they see are strangers, it creates a negative feeling. It's something that the 20th century French philosophers, I believe, called anomie, and it was just a sense that there was a lack of community, a sense that we were all just anonymous selves trapped in a lonely world, an urban jungle. I mean, growing up in a hyper-urban environment literally makes children sick. One of the best things you can do for your child's immune system is take them to a farm when they're a toddler and let them eat dirt. Let them pet strange animals. Just let them go outside and get as much dust and gunk all over them as possible. Studies show that will make them physically stronger later in life. It will reduce the odds of having any allergies. And that if a child grows up in an apartment in Manhattan, in a very, very clean environment, plenty of Lysol, and the only animals allowed near the child are sort of these manicured, pedigreed dogs, then that child is going to probably have some sort of debilitating allergy and may suffer from autoimmune issues later on in life. So, to sum up, my issue with the drugs is just that we need to be careful that we're not medicating ourselves to be able to live lives we weren't supposed to. That we need to try to fix our core environments as much as possible. Like, for example, one of my pet theories, and here we go, here's a new conspiracy theory, fresh off the farm. I think that there might be a part of the human brain that when it's counting how many friends it has, when it's trying to figure out how many people care about you, and yes, your brain does that outside of your conscious experience. In fact, the number of people who look up to you or who might follow you, that sense of how respected am I in my community, is definitely a number that we know is kept track of in the brain, and it can actually affect testosterone levels in men. Here's my little theory. I think that our brain only counts face-to-face interactions. I think that if you have 10,000 friends or followers on Facebook or Instagram or any other social media, that doesn't affect you emotionally because your brain only counts people that you meet face-to-face. And so you might have someone who's taking psychiatric medications for anxiety who may not need them if they just met more people face-to-face. So that's my concern. And that was the concern I voiced during that conversation. But my philosopher acolyte saw it as a betrayal of the power of philosophy. I think he felt that I was not giving enough respect to the immaterial elements at play. But that was the call I made at the time. And a big part of why I sided with the young lady is because it was her brain. She was the one who was experiencing her life, not this guy. And he was there, he was trying to help, and he really cared about her. And he was an intelligent guy, and he was thinking about it very hard. So I didn't want to just say, dude, just stay out of it. But ultimately, that was the call. After that, I think something changed in the group. And I started to participate less in the Dionysium events. And like I mentioned in the previous volume, I started to use Craigslist to make money. I bought some photography equipment and I got into freelance editing. And it turned out that, wow, social media was also very good for someone who wanted side hustles. I started to really enjoy this new gig economy that was developing around social media at the time. And as we all know, Austin started to get a little more expensive in the early 2010s, and I had recently moved into a larger house because of my family growing. So my priorities shifted. Instead of Vincent reaching out to create groups to talk about life, I simply reached out to find clients to make money. But I think a lot of people did that. That's kind of what you had to do to live in Austin at the time. Now's the point where I have to interrupt the whole production to talk about a personal discovery that I made just last night while I was working on the script to finish up this project and come to some sort of conclusion. And I started thinking back over my youth and friends that I knew in school. And I remembered something. I recalled something that kind of threw a wrench into the whole works. It derailed the entire train. So we'll have to talk more about the Bruce Lee debate in the next volume. We'll also have to save our revisiting of that Australopithecus walking across the African savanna until volume 4 of That Time I Started a Cult. I also was going to talk more about my grandfather and about the unusual job that he did for the U.S. Navy. he enlisted as an Army guy, but in the 1950s, he took advantage of the GI Bill training opportunities that were available to World War II veterans, and he became a jet mechanic. And by the late 1960s, his team oversaw a test facility at the North Island Naval Base in San Diego, and his specialty was repairing and putting back together engines for the F-4 Phantom fighter jet that was our primary fighter over North Vietnam during Operation Rolling Thunder in the very late 1960s. We'll talk more about that, and also a little bit about what my father was doing in Vietnam as a combat marine in southern Vietnam. There was a strange overlap moment in, it would have been 1969, where my father was recovering from severe burns in a hospital in Japan in 1969, waiting to be healed up enough to be sent right back to South Vietnam. Meanwhile, my grandfather is busy in San Diego, ensuring that there's an endless supply of F-4 Phantoms ready to bomb North Vietnam to the discussion table. And so what was this discovery that derailed my episode? Well, I had been working on the script for this for quite a while, and so I had been thinking about my life and childhood for the last couple of weeks, and it occurred to me that the entire basis of this series is a lie. This entire series is based on a lie, on an untruth. Based on what I've been talking about up to this point, it sounds like I started a cult when I was 36, in my late 30s, in the early 2010s. And that is kind of a sane age to start a cult. That sounds like a sane person, or at least a sane cult leader. Alexander the Great died in his mid-30s. Julius Caesar's career, however, didn't even start until his mid-30s. On his 33rd birthday, Caesar had a drunken, crying pity party about how little he had achieved at that age and how Alexander had conquered all of Asia by age 33. And of course, Jesus of Nazareth was crucified at age 33, give or take a few years. But I did a lot better than that. I did not start my first cult in my late 30s. It turns out that I started my first cult when I was 8 years old. And I didn't live in Austin then. This was 1983. I didn't even live in Winnie. I lived in Hankamer, Texas. Hankamer. Hankamer. And at the time, the population was roughly 700 people. We lived in a pier and beam house that was built in 1870. It was owned by my mother's mother's mother, and we lived there while my grandfather single-handedly built our house near Winnie in what used to be a rice field. Anyway, Hankamer is not a swamp like Winnie is. The Hankamer house was not in the middle of a rice field. Hankamer is very dry by comparison. Lots of piney woods. Very spooky, old, scary woods. Forests that contained hidden graveyards. And we'll talk about that. I definitely saw a ghost inside this Hankamer house. There were also some really, really weird nights and some events in that house that really get me thinking in terms of paranormal type stuff. We'll talk about that. But for now, I'll just say it includes seeing a gigantic beach ball of ball lightning traveling through the house at one point. seeing the ghost of what appears to have been an old man who died in that house in the 1890s of tuberculosis. Well, I think the story is that he was smothered under a pillow by his long-suffering wife, who couldn't stand to see him deteriorate any further. And it just may be the case that I encountered our old friends, the Greys, in that house, and we'll talk about that. I also need to stress, though, that some of my best childhood memories of all time occurred in this old house in Hancomer, Texas. Guys, Christmas in the early 1980s was awesome for a kid. There were so many cool gift ideas. I remember waking up to all kinds of cool stuff like boom boxes, little TVs, the first computers that anybody could buy, period. Action figures, Star Wars stuff, and of course, my favorite of all time, my Indiana Jones playset. Now, Hancomer did not have its own school. It was way too small for that. It had 2 churches, but it was too small for a school. So I rode the bus to the Anahuac Elementary School in Anahuac, Texas, or as my great-grandmother pronounced it, Anahuac. It's a Native American name. Anahuac. I'm not sure if Anahuac is bigger or smaller now, but at the time, around 1983, it would have had a population of about 2,000 people. So, that means it was the big city. Anahuac was the county seat of Chambers County, and for political reasons, this tiny elementary school I went to was not old and little and run down. It was gigantic and recently built, and they spent a lot of money. It was state-of-the-art. So you might be thinking, oh gosh, in the early 80s, Vincent went to this little tiny elementary school in very, very rural Texas. So it was some sort of one-room shack, and we had a concrete slab half court for basketball and basically just an empty field to run around on during recess. It was actually the opposite. The air conditioning was awesome. I remember feeling like I was freezing all the time because we didn't have air conditioning at my house, but Anahuac Elementary at the time was this giant futuristic edifice of brick and steel and glass. The carpets were clean. The library was huge and modern and comfortable. The gym was enormous. The playground had a gigantic pavilion for basketball, multiple huge sandboxes on the playground, and my favorite feature of the playground was a kind of wooden castle/pirate ship playscape, where there was a place where you could steer the boat with the big steering wheel with the pegs, like a pirate ship, and then a nylon net that you could climb up and down like a sailboat. But did I spend my elementary school years playing like a normal kid? Not a chance. During that time, I remember that I was just obsessively studying one thing after another, and they were all things that made me afraid. Things I was scared of. So I was always reading a book about ghosts, or, of course, aliens, or war, especially nuclear war. And you would think in 1983, on that playground in Anahuac, Texas, little Vincent must have been obsessed with nuclear war, because that's around the time that concerns about nuclear war were all over the news, and you had miniseries on TV like The Day After, that covered all the grim realities of what a nuclear war would actually entail. But I had actually switched over to killer bees by that point. And that spring in 1983, I was determined to monitor the bees on the playground to check for behavior or morphological features that you would tend to see only in what they would call Africanized bees. In other words, killer bees. I would collect specimens of bees from the playground, and I would try to spot any visual differences that would indicate infiltration of a killer bee population. And I also made sure to stay near entrances to the school building in case any distress pheromones called the rest of the hive to attack me. Okay, well, what does this have to do with cults? Little 8-year-old Vincent, with his 8 is enough haircut and his slacks, walking around on the playground, grabbing honeybees and having them sting the top of the Velcro strap of my shoes in order to extract the stinger and have them die so that I could study them later on. You would think that some kid that spent his time doing that, despite a state-of-the-art awesome playground available, you would think that a kid who did that would pretty much be a girl repellent. You'd think he wouldn't have a lot of friends. But there was this one girl, Elizabeth, who would come to talk to me while I did this, and she made it clear that she thought it was very mean what I was doing to the bees. But she came back to talk to me the next day. Now, where do we go from here? What does this have to do with cults? Well, it turns out that there was this guy that liked Elizabeth and really didn't like that she liked to hang out with me doing my weird bee stuff. And so, let's just say little 8-year-old Vincent got into some fights. And that's when I learned about organizations like NATO. Little 8-year-old Vincent, maybe due to my native ancestry, was a bit of a late bloomer in terms of physicality. So 8-year-old Vincent was pretty far from having any sort of facial hair. He was pretty far from being muscular. He wasn't little, but he definitely was scrawny. And so I started to read up about ideas about things like treaties or defensive pacts. And I started to realize that that's essentially what gangs are. Gangs are defensive pacts. They are agreements between people to pool their physicality in order to defend themselves. So in Volume 4, we'll talk about the formation of a group that I called the Eagles. And this was before I was really into classic music, and I really didn't make the connection with the rock band. I was thinking of the actual animals, and I was looking for an animal that represented bravery and solitude and seriousness. So I was in a completely different mindset or mind frame than the guys in the actual band, the Eagles. I gotta say, probably I was not as cool as Glenn Frey. I was probably cooler than Joe Walsh. We'll leave it at that. So in the next volume, we'll talk about this defensive league that I formed and the members of the group, the Eagles. Not the rock band, but the dangerous gang of 8-year-olds in Anahuac, Texas in 1983. And we'll talk about how I tested their devotion to the cause. Because after all, what's the point of having a defensive league if you cannot actually activate it when you need it? So it turns out that my experience with cults goes way back. And back when Ma Anand Sheela was ruling the Rajneesh cult with an iron fist in the early 80s in Oregon, at the same time, in the early 80s, in Hancomer, Texas, I was forming my own cult. Little Vincent's first cult. It was very cute. So this leads to the same question that I think I've asked before. Why do people do this? We know that the people who join cults are not stupid. They aren't weak. I know this from experience. In fact, it's often the leaders who are the weaker ones. In many cases, there are followers in a cult who are stronger and smarter than the cult leader. In fact, in Bhagwan Sri Rajneesh's case, his chief administrator, Ma Anand Sheela, was one of his most fervent followers, but in many ways, she was more far-sighted and more determined and more calculating than he was, even though he was the one walking around in golden robes and walking over rose petals that his followers fanatically threw at his feet. And so why do people do this? I think it's pretty simple. People have a deep, inborn, unshakable, genetic, human need to belong to a close-knit, supportive group. And part of the reason for this close-knit, supportive group is to offer a sense of purpose for life. I think this need for purpose and this need for other people is paramount. It's inescapable. And the saddest and most damaged people on earth are the people who think that they don't need other people, or people who think that they can live without hope, that they can live well without hope. But I think that just like the minute your brain is deprived of oxygen, within seconds, it begins to die. I think that when people are deprived of meaningful relationships with other people, and when people are deprived of hope, they immediately begin to die on the inside. And then once they're completely dead on the inside, which could take years, that's when they finally start dying on the outside, i.e. physically, as in they get sick. You can see it in their diet. People without hope, people with bad relationships, tend to have bad diets because they have to numb themselves all day. We all do it a little bit. But how do we know when we've crossed the line into something unhealthy? Well, I think I know. And I think Aristotle gave us a hint. The original idea behind recreation, the reason why there's an R-E at the beginning of the word, which implies something is being redone, restored, put back the way it was, or returned to some form. The idea is that it's supposed to refresh you or restore you so that you can be prepared to do more work tomorrow. So recreation is supposed to be a kind of active rest that prepares us emotionally to take on more stress so that we can get back on our purpose. So yes, it's absolutely an escape, but it's supposed to be a temporary escape. The temporary part is very important. Once our entire lives become recreation, that's when we start to get weak, emotionally and mentally, and eventually physically. Other people can be annoying, but unfortunately, it appears that we require the emotional workout of conflict with other people and conflict with nature, as in gathering firewood or repairing a leaking pipe, to remain strong. So we hate conflict, but we also need it. So what's the best way to avoid premature aging? Looks like exercise and mental activity. And the more frustrating and unnecessary the mental activity, the better. Are you pushing 60 and now you're worried about dementia? Just learn a musical instrument. Learn a new language. Read Immanuel Kant's Kritik der reinen Vernunft, also known as A Critique of Pure Reason. Immanuel Kant's IQ was well over 200, and his books are famously difficult to read in any language. But if you force yourself to read it in German, then you'll have the added bonus of having learned German. It'll make it a lot harder. But hey, you definitely won't have to worry about dementia. So before our next episode, before Volume 4, make sure to have Critique of Pure Reason read, or even reread. To be honest, you're going to have to reread it before our next episode. There won't be a test, but in the next volume, I'm pretty much just going to start talking as though you've got that book memorized. So just be ready. So in the next volume, we will talk about the Eagles, not the famous rock band, but the less famous gang of dangerous 8-year-old Texans. And we'll talk about my memories of that and what happened to the guys who formed that group. And we'll finally get back to that lonely Australopithecus who is part of a population that is evolving into something like Homo habilis, wandering through the African savanna looking for flint, i.e., looking for purpose. We'll get back to that guy. I think that little hairy ape thing has a lot in common with little 8-year-old Vincent, with his 8 is enough haircut. But we'll talk about that in Volume 4 of That Time I Started a Cult. And so, until then, I'll talk to you later.